Well, good evening. It's good to see all of you tonight. Happy to have another opportunity to study with you in the book of Matthew. We're going to look at chapter 13 and verse 51, hopefully down to chapter 14 and verse 12. Parable of the householder and Jesus' second rejection at Nazareth and John the Baptist beheaded. Before we enter into our study, we want to begin with the word of prayer. We'll ask Brother Billy to lead our minds. Amen. All right, we were looking at chapter 13 of Matthew is the chapter about the parables, where he groups together a number of parables. And the last one that is mentioned says, "Have you understood all these things?" And they said to him, "Yes." And Jesus said to them, "Therefore every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household who brings out of his treasures things new and old." And some call this the parable of the householder, maybe the last of the parables. At least it's a statement where this is like that, if nothing else, if it's not a parable. It's the same kind of concept. And have they understood these spiritual principles about the nature of his kingdom and how that kingdom grows? If so, then these apostles, these ones that he has given the insights into how to interpret these parables, and all of us that are teachers, says every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom, a learner about the kingdom of heaven, and you know about how to be saved, and you know how this spiritual kingdom citizenship works, and all of those things of the gospel, then he should be like the head of a household who, when he is providing for his family or his guests, that he would bring out old things and new things that he brings to them. And then, of course, we have to think, well, what would be the application as far as a teacher of the gospel, bringing out old things and new things? Could be the idea he takes the things that he has learned, of course, from the Word of God, the gospel, and he tries to, of course, you can't alter what the doctrine is, but try to apply that with the new experiences that you get as you live your life. There are many insights and understandings of life that I have now that when I was 20 years old and I was preaching, I didn't. I studied the Bible the same way, and I had the passages, the same way, but there were examples and experience and application, that not the same as I have 40-something years later. I've lived a lot since then. Could be that. Some take it with the idea of the Old Testament things and the New Testament things. Maybe that's the application that he's got. They have all of the things that we study as scribes of God's kingdom, all of those messianic prophecies that we study as we go through the Old Testament, and the things that point ahead to Christ in the church, and the principles, how God deals with people, and apply that along with all the new revelation that's been given. Now, it's kind of opinion which way we go, exactly how that's applied. He doesn't tell us exactly what he means by old and new. We have to make application of that ourselves. Wouldn't both of those be a good thing for a teacher to be able to do? To know your Old Testament and know how the New Testament works, or to take your experience as time goes by and be able to bring new things out when you preach a lesson that you weren't able to do in the past. Make it applicable to the audience you have right now instead of the one you had 30 years ago. There were different circumstances, different maybe problems in the church you were dealing with, things that you could bring to it. Anybody else have a thought on the verse there? Yes, Brother Bill. Absolutely, that's true. I think one of the illustrations one writer gave is like the scribes and Pharisees. They were always quoting the wisdom of the ancient rabbis, and what they thought 300-400 years ago or whatever, instead of making things applicable to what's going on right now. And maybe that's part of what Jesus is getting at there, that you have to make sure you're constantly, applying things to the situation we're dealing with. But like I say, both those things could be true, and certainly the point, you can't get away. If I'm teaching something new in the sense of it's a new doctrine, I'm in error, because this doctrine's 2,000 years old. Right? The New Testament revelation was given once and for all, and you can't change it. But how we apply it in our marriages, the principles that are found there, and circumstances that we're in, those things we can always learn some more wisdom about how to make application of what the Bible teaches, to obey it. Okay. Then we're told about Jesus' visit to the city of Nazareth. I don't know that how chronological. Matthew kind of groups his things by subject and throws things in a little different order sometimes than you find in Mark and Luke. And this visit to Nazareth might be one of those places. It says, when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed from there. So that's sort of the end of that section. And then he tells us the story about what happened at Nazareth when he went there. I think in the book of Luke, when you read the account of his visit to Nazareth, that there's two different times he went there. There's one time that there's no mention of the disciples, and Jesus went to Nazareth, and he got up and read the scriptures and told them it applied to him, and the people objected to, him. They were jealous about where he came from, and at the end of that, they were going to throw him off a cliff outside of town, and Jesus just walked through their midst and left. None of that part's mentioned in this account. So it's thought by many scholars that this isn't just an abbreviated account, it's the second time he went to Nazareth. But the results are about the same, as far as they still have the same prejudice about his upbringing and aren't willing to put their faith in him and receive him. It says, he came to his hometown and began teaching them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and this miraculous powers? So Jesus comes in, he's teaching things that are divine wisdom, and they've heard about all of the miracles that he's been doing in Capernaum and in other places. And where did he get this? Well, the logical answer would be, if you weren't prejudiced and disposed to disbelieve, you'd say God gave him these things. But it almost sounds like they're having the same kind of objection that the Pharisees were offering up, that this is of the devil or some magic or something illegitimate that he's doing these things. Because it should be God's with him. That's why he's got this wisdom and he can do miracles, right? That'd be the logical conclusion. They're saying, how is this guy able to do that? And so it sounds like maybe they're expressing what some of these Pharisees have been saying about Jesus. And he's there at his hometown, the town of his fathers, or his fatherland, the place where Mary and Joseph lived. And Jesus grew up there along with his half-brothers and sisters in that place. It mentions that the apostles were with him when he came to this place in Mark's account of this trip. And so he has his disciples, the apostles, there with him. And Mark says it was on the Sabbath day that he was in the synagogue and did this teaching. That's all in Mark chapter 6 and verses 1 and 2. And the people that were listening were astonished at his teaching, it says. So they were struck out of their senses, is the idea, just amazed and filled with wonder that this man that was a carpenter and the carpenter's son comes here and teaches this divine wisdom and teaches like somebody that's been formally educated somewhere when he wasn't. And they know he wasn't, didn't go off to some school somewhere to learn these things that he's saying. So they are astonished. So it's marvelous teaching. They hear about the miracles, but because they're so familiar with him growing up and his family, just ordinary people there in town, they just can't accept the idea that he could be a great prophet that's come to do these things. So The only way to really define this teaching and understand it is that he's divine, that God is with him, that's why he can do it. And if you reject that, then how do you explain it, right? That's the reason they're in a quandary, because they're too prejudiced to accept that part. And when Jesus had finished, or second part there, it says that they were asking, where did he get this wisdom, this skill, this cleverness, learning, these miracles? And again, it's divine power is what the word miracle means. It's something where you're exercising power beyond the laws of nature. That's what a miracle means. Something that can't be explained through natural means that Jesus is doing. So, again, they can't deny the teaching, and they've heard about his power, but he's not the kind of Messiah they're looking for. They're looking for somebody that's kingly, right, to come along. Well, he grew up here in town, and maybe not even on the best side of town, and he had this menial trade for making a living, and we know his brothers and sisters and all of that. So how could he be the king, right? The great teacher that we're all waiting on. And Jesus is going to say this is not just him, but this happens to a lot of people when it comes to their hometown and the way people look at you when you're trying to teach them something, right? When you've been changed by the gospel and you go back, try to teach them, a lot of times it doesn't work very well. They might be less likely to receive you than anybody. Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, and his sisters, are they not all with us? Where then did this man get all these things? So we know where he comes from, and just reinforces the idea this guy can't be anybody special. We know him too well. We've seen him for too long, and all the people associated with him growing up. You notice there's not any charge about sin, though, is there? It's not we know he's a sinner. We know he was immoral. No, it's just we know his social circumstances. How could this guy? It's all about the outward trappings, and circumstances, his economic standing or whatever that they're complaining about. Just an ordinary family, no royalty or anything special about him or his family. And again, it shows here that Jesus had 4 brothers. These brothers are half-brothers. They were born of Mary and Joseph, but Jesus, of course, his father is God. After Joseph took Mary after Jesus was born, he didn't have relationship with her sexually until after Jesus was born, which certainly implies they had children and so on after that. And everybody in the early church believed that. We have writings that have been handed down to us about what the Christians right after the New Testament was written, what they said about Jesus' brothers and sisters, and they all thought just like I'm saying, that these were his half-brothers and sisters that's being talked about. But we know in the Middle Ages they got this doctrine in the Catholic Church where they set Mary apart as being somebody that you had to go through. She's the mother of God, and she's a mediator, and she's sinless, and she was a perpetual virgin. They started teaching that, and so then they had to modify what they were teaching about these brothers and sisters. And so, no, it's using it in the sense of his cousins and not his physical brothers. But that's a later invention just to prop up this doctrine. And, of course, that kind of thing happens. Yes, Brother Randall? This would be one of the passages that would seem to indicate that. They don't mention him. And there's no mention of him anywhere in the, after Jesus' childhood, he was there at 12 when he was at the temple. But after that, you don't ever read about Joseph again. So it's thought maybe he had passed away. She looked to Jesus, at that marriage feast to take care of things. She didn't look to her husband to do that. And John took over and caring for her, at the cross. So it sounds like Joseph was out of the picture by then. So, again, these claims are too high for them to admit being true, but yet they're so well accredited it's hard for them to deny them altogether since he's doing all of these signs. But it says they took offense at him But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and his own household. So he sets forth a parable there, or a wise proverb that is true, that many times a prophet would be honored anywhere but where he came from. They'd be the ones that wouldn't think, oh, he's no different than us, because he grew up here. So, and he said in his own household. And they took offense. The word offense there, the Greek word is scandalizo, and it means to put a stumbling block in somebody's way and be led into sin, to be repelled by, or to take offense in one. Thayer says in this verse, find occasion of stumbling, in essence to see in another what I disapprove of and what hinders me from acknowledging his authority or to believe in him, is the idea here in this passage. He's got this, we know his ordinary upbringing, we know his family, and they just stumbled over that. They could not accept him for what he was because of these preconceived prejudice in their minds. And it caused them to stumble and reject Jesus. And since we're no different as human beings than the people of Nazareth, we always have to check ourselves and think, are we allowing prejudice in some way where we've got our mind made up without the evidence to judge somebody, right? Any of us can fall into the same thing on some other thing, some other subject. And we always have to be careful. Are we just looking at the truth? Are we just judging righteous judgment? Or are we judging by appearance? Jesus said, don't judge by appearance, judge righteous judgment. Look at what the real facts are. Don't let your prejudice lead you away from coming to the right conclusion. But it caused them to stumble, his background that he had. He is called in Mark's gospel a carpenter, and he's called the son of the carpenter in Matthew's gospel. Justin Martyr said he made plows and the like, and he wrote in the first half of the 2nd century, talking about Jesus' upbringing. And again, he said that his brothers were some common young men and girls, but in other cities he was considered mighty in word and deed, but not in his hometown. And it's confirmed when he says his own household, not just his hometown, but John says, doesn't he, in John 7:5, his brothers weren't believing in him at that time. So even his own family wasn't believing in him until after the crucifixion. And they saw him raised from the dead. That changed everything. So they were even stubborn in accepting him. But there was so much evidence that they become, of course, leaders in the church afterwards. James, the Lord's brother, was an elder, counted among the apostles. He was so well thought of. Pillar in the church. Died for the faith. Jude calls himself Jude, the brother of James. He doesn't say the brother of Jesus, but the brother of James. They all have this humility. And he wrote the book of Jude. We're told that Jude had children. One of the early writers, Eusebius, said that during the time of Domitian, they arrested his grandson, the sons of Jude, and they, were accusing them of thinking they were royalty or something, and they saw what common people they were, and they took their property, but they didn't put them to death or anything. So we know a little bit about these, at least what's handed down about the earthly brothers of Christ, and even some grandchildren. Then, verse 58, and he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. So, you just think about all of the miracles that were done in some of these places, just wonderful miracles. But you find the same thing among the apostles. When people really believe and they're excited about the gospel, there's, like in Ephesus, Paul did all kinds of amazing things, and Peter in Jerusalem. But where you have people that don't believe and don't want to come and don't want to hear, the Lord doesn't allow as many things to take place then in that place. It's not that the miracles are dependent on whether a person believes or not, but as the Lord just doesn't give them the same number of privileges to see these things if they don't have any faith in that community or that group of people. I think it says in Mark he could do no miracles. He states it in that negative of a way because of their unbelief that they had. Not according to God's purpose. He couldn't do these things there because of their attitude. It wasn't God's will for him to do them there. So, two conditions for a miracle: you have to have an opportunity to display this power, and there has to be sufficient moral purpose, and they don't have it. They don't want to come and get healed, right? So how are you going to do many healings there? They won't even come. So unbelief prevented them from being able to be healed, and it does mention that he did lay his hand on a few sick people in Mark and healed them, but it was very few that would come to him. So shows their stubbornness. And in Mark 6:6, after this, it says he wondered at their unbelief. There's only 2 times Jesus wondered that it mentions. One time is at the centurion's faith. This Gentile said, "You just say the word, my servant will be healed." He said, "I've not found that kind of faith in all of Israel." And here is the second time, is the people of Nazareth are so prejudiced that they can't believe. It's like they won't accept him because of his upbringing. He wondered at their unbelief. In the Old Testament, we're told about God wondering about the stubbornness of the wicked and people, right, in the book of Psalms. So it's not like contrary to his divine nature that he would wonder. It's certainly a part of our human nature to wonder, isn't it? But you also have those kind of expressions about God. It's like, a cat, an oxen or a donkey knows its master and will do what it's. But you people are more stubborn than a donkey, right? There's those kind of statements in the Old Testament about how stubborn people can be. So, again, he had the actual feelings of a person, of any human being, and we wonder at the stupidity of people sometimes and unreasonableness. But so does God in the prophets sometimes, the same thing. Any other thoughts here in chapter 13? Anybody want to bring out, or any points you'd like to make? I've heard even the example of Saul. He came to Jerusalem. He knew all those people. He used to work with them, and he said, "They know I used to persecute." And Jesus said, "No, they will not receive you here. You got to go. You got to get out of town. Go to the Gentiles." And so to his human reason, Paul thought, no, these people really ought to listen to me. But he said, they're not going to listen to you. So Lord knows. Yeah. But there's others to go help and save, and he moves on. So the next thing that Matthew tells us about is the death of John the Baptist. And what happened as far as that great forerunner of Christ who came in the spirit and power of Elijah. It was a matter of prophecy, his coming. So in verses 1 through 12 of Matthew, it says, "At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the news about Jesus and said to his servants, 'This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him.'" So Herod Antipas was in charge of Galilee and Perea. And all of the fame about Jesus has finally come into his palace. And he is afraid of Jesus, thinking he's got these powers because he's actually John the Baptist that he killed. He's very superstitious. He believes in ghosts and powers. They had ideas among the Greeks and the Romans. If somebody comes back from the spirit realm, they have special powers that they can exercise. And he thinks that's why Jesus, he's really John. Which shows something about his guilty conscience for what he did to John the Baptist. It's eating him up that he's thinking this way about this man when he hears about him. Other people think Jesus is some other great prophet or something, but he thinks John because he killed John. And he's thinking, he's come back. So let's look, there's more information that is found in Mark and Luke. And rather than me just throwing it out, we'll just read it as it's found there. "And King Herod heard of it, for his name had become well known, and the people were saying John the Baptist has risen from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others were saying he is Elijah, and others were saying he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he kept saying, John, whom I beheaded, has risen. So you get a little bit more detail there in the book of Mark, where Peter's telling the story. And then Luke chapter 9, Luke's account, it says, Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was happening, and he was greatly perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen again. And Herod said, I myself had John beheaded, but who is this man about whom I hear such things? And he kept trying to see him. So he's wanting to find Jesus and be able to see him, and he doesn't get to see him until the day Jesus is condemned to death, right? That he went to Herod, and Pilate sent him to him, and Jesus wouldn't answer him a word. So it was very dissatisfying when he finally did get to see him, wasn't it? His soldiers mocked Jesus, but Jesus wouldn't even talk to him when he got there. But so we get some more, a little fuller account of what is really more summarized in the book of Matthew about Herod. You notice he's called the Tetrarch in Luke and in Matthew, and he calls him king in the book of Mark. And that's being used in just a colloquial way that, the way the people would talk and say King Herod, but he wasn't really a king. He was really a tetrarch. A tetrarch is a ruler of a fourth or a petty ruler. You have a king. The Romans would give like a whole big area to a king, and you got special honors and titles. And then there's ethnarch, where you're over like a province maybe. That's what Archelaus was. And then there's this kind where you're just a petty ruler. You're just over a small part of a region. And we're going to see, when you study the story about Herod Antipas, he really wanted to be called king. And it's what ends up getting him kicked out of office. It's when he tries to go to Rome and get that title, is what Josephus tells us. So Antipas got, when Herod the Great, he's the one that killed the babies at Jerusalem, and he ruled over all of that area. But when he died, in his will, he divided his inheritance up to 3 sons, or 3 relatives, or one of them was a grandson. There's Archelaus got Judah, Antipas got Galilee and Perea, and then Philip got another area. So that's the reason he's called a tetrarch. He just got part of the inheritance. He was in his palace at Machaerus, that's located down here along if you look at this on the map there, down on the Dead Sea, about halfway down is Machaerus, and it's on top of one of these big hills. You can go tour that today if you were over there. There's the ruins of his palace. There's a dungeon where John the Baptist was kept underneath that. So he's quite a ways from Galilee. You can see if he spent a lot of time down there, he wouldn't have heard everything that was going on about Jesus for a while. But now he knows about it. And he's wanting to see Jesus. He's the one, Antipas is the one he calls that fox. You go tell Herod that fox, I'm leaving, I'm getting out of here. I'll be here today and tomorrow, and then I'm gone. He doesn't get to see Jesus. He heard those miracles, hears about the fame, but people think he's a prophet, but they don't ever say he's the Christ, do they? He doesn't have the pomp and the trappings of what they thought the Christ would be. But they do know he's some kind of prophet like Jeremiah, or they had this idea between the Testaments that, these prophets could come back and do things. That's where they got this false idea that he might be one of these prophets of the Old Testament that's come back to earth. And he might be the Elijah that Malachi talked about was going to come. So a lot of confusion about Jesus. But they highly esteem John and Jesus, even though John never did any miracles. And again, I think I've said most everything on this chart here. Then verse 3, it says, "And when Herod had John arrested, he bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. And John had been saying to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.' And in Mark's gospel it says, 'And Herod himself had sent and had John arrested and bound in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, 'It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife.'" So when John was preaching about the need for repentance, he also taught the same truth to Herod that he taught to everybody else. That you got to repent of your sins, and his sin was that he was married to Herodias. Herodias, there is a Herod Philip that didn't get an inheritance, he didn't get a territory. He lived in Rome. And Antipas went there, and he stayed at his brother Philip's house. And he was married to Herodias, his, the brother, it's like his niece. He was married to her. That wasn't lawful either, really. But then he was infatuated with her, and while he was staying there at his brother's house, she was infatuated in him. They made a pact together, we'll both divorce our mates and marry each other. So he repaid the hospitality his brother showed him by stealing his wife and went back to Palestine, back to Galilee. And he was married to King Aretas, the Nabatean king. He was married to his daughter, and Herod Antipas divorced her, and she divorced Philip, and then they married each other. So this marriage was wrong. Several different ways it was wrong. They were too closely related to be married because, according to the old law, they were too close in family, be like first cousins or whatever, marrying each other. And then you also have the fact that neither one of them, both of them's husbands or wives were alive, and they didn't have any reason to be divorced. So either way you look at it, John's was right, and he said it's not lawful for you to have her. And on this next chart, just to show you this family, Antipater is the one that starts this Herod family. Antipater, he has all of from Cypros, his wife, he has all of these different sons, and one of them is Herod the Great. He's the one, he was friends with Antony and Cleopatra, and he ran that whole area. He's the one that started building the temple in Jerusalem and persecuted put those babies to death. The wise men came to see him. And then he had a number of different children that we read about in the New Testament. Here's Archelaus. He's the one that took over Judah when they came back out of Egypt after Joseph and Mary and Jesus had fled to Egypt. They saw that Archelaus in Matthew, it tells he was in charge. He's very wicked. So they said, we need to go to Galilee. We can't stay in Bethlehem. So they left Judah because of him. He got replaced later by a Roman. He was so corrupt, the Romans put a Roman governor in charge of Judea. At the same time that he got his kingdom, Herod Antipas got Galilee and got Perea. And then there's another Agrippa over there. Agrippa the First, he's the one that gets in charge there in the time of the book of Acts in chapter 12. He takes over, and he has James beheaded, and he tried to kill Peter. That is Agrippa. It's an interesting story about him. If you look at this chart, Herodias and Agrippa are brother and sister. See, they got the same mother and father up here, Aristobulus and this. And when she was married to Antipas, he didn't have any kingdom. And he came and stayed with them, and Agrippa, and she looked down on him. But he went back to Rome to live. And when he was in Rome, he got to be good friends with Gaius, or we know him as Caligula, who became Caesar. And so later on, Agrippa gets given Judah, and he gets the title king. And they become so jealous, Herodias does, and Herod, that he gets to be called king, and he's just a tetrarch, that they decide they're going to go to Rome and appeal to Gaius or Caligula. And Agrippa, he sent a letter ahead saying he's being disloyal, he's working with the Parthians and all of this. And so when he gets there, he gets kicked out of office and exiled. And Herodias, because, she's her brother, Caligula likes him. So she was going to get to keep her property, but Herodias went into exile with Herod Antipas. They went to Lyon over in Gaul or France. You heard about that city? Anyway, this doesn't work out for them in the end after they killed John the Baptist. It doesn't pay the sin that they commit. But what a family, right? And then Agrippa the First, he's the one that took the honor of God upon himself, right? And God sent an angel who struck him. He was eaten with worms and died. And his son is Agrippa down there, Agrippa the Second. He's the one in Acts chapter 26 that Paul makes his appeal, to and preaches his sermon to. Says Agrippa says, why in this short time you would make me a Christian? That's that. A lot of Herods, right? Herod this and Herod that. Here's that Herod Philip there that she was married to first, and then she ends up getting married to Herod Antipas. Anyway, complicated chart. All of that comes down to us from Jewish writings, especially Josephus. He mentions all of this sordid stories of all this whole family because they were the ones in charge there for so many years. So Herodias, she's the daughter of Aristobulus, son of Herod the Great, and she's married to, again, her half brother Herod Philip, and she's got a daughter that Josephus tells her name. We don't have her name in the Bible. It's just her daughter in the New Testament. But her name was Salome. That was her name. And she's separated, again, from Antipas. She gets rebuked there by John. There's too close a relationship, and it's also adultery. And John is, because she's so upset over him preaching these sermons against their marriage, she has him to arrest John the Baptist. And Herod might have had some other reasons. He didn't like the influence John had over people, but he locked John up in prison. But he's afraid of doing anything to John. He would just like to keep him locked up and not take it any further than that. We're told in verse 5, says, although Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd because they regarded John as a prophet. So even when he got to the point where he wanted to get rid of John, he was afraid of the people. Before that, he was afraid of who John was. So you can see, when I guess Herodias kind of wore him down on that, and then so he had two fears when you read Mark and Matthew. In Mark it says, and Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death and could not do so, for Herod was afraid of John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and kept him safe. And when he heard him, he was very perplexed, but he used to enjoy listening to him. So for a while, he had fear of John because he thought John was an important godly person. But later on, he wanted to put him to death, but he was afraid this is just going to cause too much trouble with the people because they think John's a prophet. So he didn't want. He had two reasons that kind of held him back. But so we can see behind all of this is this Herodias. She was a woman scorned, and she's got it in for John. She wants him dead for calling them out about their marriage, and she wants him put to death. And it's one of those things that's just true to life, isn't it? That kind of thing happens. You offend somebody preaching the truth, the wrong person with a lot of power and influence, and they got it in for you. They're just looking for an opportunity to get rid of you one way or another. And that's exactly what happened to John. But when Herod's birthday came, this is where she gets her opportunity. And we're told in the book of Mark, it says, a strategic day came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his lords and military commanders and leading men of Galilee. That's what made it an opportune time. He's got all of these evil companions around him, and they're having a big drunken party, I guess. And if you really want to twist somebody's mind, that'd be a good opportunity to do it, right? While they're drunk and they're around their evil companions, and you can get them to do things a lot of times they wouldn't do if they were in their right mind and by themselves. And so it shows again how the devil can work on us, doesn't it? I mean, just a general principle we can learn. Evil companions can get you into all kinds of trouble. And so he's having his party here. He's got the lords, the great men of the country, and the commanders, the chiliarchs, that's heads of 1,000 men, colonels and generals and things like that are there at his party, leading men of the country. And look at the technique that she uses to bring John down. And the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Mark, again, is a little fuller in his account of what happened. It says, and when the daughter of Herodias herself came in, so it sounds like there were other dancers before her, but even the princess comes in because of her mother. She comes in and dances for him. And she pleased Herod and his dinner's guest, and the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. And he swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom. So this must have been some dance, right, that she led there among these drunken men. And, that's usually pictured in these films they make of the life of Christ as some sexual dance she did, and very well may have been. That Herodias might have known just the way that she could go out there and dance and get what she wanted from Herod. So that was the last one there? Okay. Well, we'll come back and see the end of the story and the other miracles in this chapter next time.